Okay, good afternoon. We're going to continue our look at non-Western traditions today and how it relates to modernism with Professor Robert Cowherd. Robert studied architecture at the Cooper Union, and he got his PhD from MIT. He's now a professor at Wentworth in Boston, where he teaches studios and seminars. And as you can see from some of his work that I put up here, a lot of his recent writing has been very directly addressing this question of modernism and what is modernism. So he has a piece in a forthcoming book which relates to Indonesia, which I'll be talking about today. He also had recent pieces in Architecture Boston and Footprint, which is the Delft School of Architecture journal, addressing the question of what is modernity and what does it mean for us today. Professor Cowherd is also intimately familiar with this course because, along with Professor Bart, he taught it for a few years, so he knows it well. So we're very lucky to have him with us. Please welcome Robert Cowherd.
Thank you, Ian, Ijlal, and Michael, for having me. It's great to be back at RISD. I miss this place. It's a great school. This lecture is called Identity Tectonics. It's a play on the idea of identity politics. And there are several themes that are embedded in this lecture. And another big influence on this lecture was a lecture I first gave when I taught in this room last time, many years ago. And I decided to bring some of that material into this lecture, and it seems to work. We'll see. But this starts out as a narrative. And I'll take one of those, actually. It was a Friday night in the city of Bandung, West Java, in 1923, when two architects, ethnically Dutch architects, but they were born in what was then called the Netherlands East Indies. It was a colony of the Netherlands on the other side of the world. And you may have studied something about the Netherlands in this course, or you will, I suspect. The Netherlands is one of the smallest countries in the world with one of the highest population densities. And it was powerful beyond all reasonable expectation, in part because it was such a powerful trader globally and internationally. And their most powerful trade operation was in what was originally a monopoly holding in Southeast Asia, where all the spices came from. They traded Manhattan for it, in part. And also, later this turned into the only way they could keep control of their monopoly is by colonizing what we now think of as being Indonesia. So on this night in 1923, these two architects faced each other on a stage in a building very similar to this one, and they debated what was the proper architectural identity for the Javanese part of the Netherlands. And so the two protagonists are listed on your sheet. Wolf Schumacher argued very forcefully that there is really nothing worthy of being called architecture in Java. Architecture, as we think of it in the civilized West, is really beyond anything that can be found in Java except for one thing, and that are the stone monuments. The stone monuments that were left behind, like Borobudur, the largest Buddhist temple in the world, built around the year 900 or 800. And a neighboring temple of Prambanan that was a Hindu temple built a little bit earlier. And other than these massive stone monuments and several dozen others that are left in ruins, more or less abandoned, scattered around the island of Java, there was really nothing worth even thinking about in terms of architecture. Across the stage from Schumacher was a man by the name of Henri Maclean Pont, and also Dutch, also born in the Netherlands Indies in Java. Both of them were educated at Delft, back in Holland, and both of them were very prominent, active architects in the colonial service in the 1920s. And Henri Maclean Pont was married to a Javanese woman, and he was a big fan of the shadow puppet plays, the gamelan classical music traditions, and all of the arts of Java. And he instinctively had this feeling that there was more to Javanese architecture than simply these dead monuments. Now, the monuments are very clear examples, especially Borobudur, of something that is not just a symbol, not just a reflection of a dominant cultural presence of Buddhism. It was also an instrument of devotion in the Buddhist tradition. And this is one of the first themes, this is really the first big thing I want to point out in this lecture, is that we are very comfortable, and the tradition of teaching the history of architecture often takes for granted or states it explicitly that the material artifacts that we construct are a clear and direct reflection of our values and what is important to us at any given time. So here's an example of a Buddhist temple. At one point, for a brief period in Java, Buddhism was the most important cultural manifestation on the island, and they devoted huge amounts of resources to the construction of this temple. But it wasn't just a reflection, a passive expression of cultural meanings. It was also, and this is the point I want to point out that is not so commonly understood, it is an instrument. It was an instrument of the culture's operation in that society. And it's very clearly and explicitly used as an instrument because the idea is to start at the bottom and use it as a landscape for walking meditation. The meditation, when you think of meditation, you think of sitting under the tree cross-legged and focusing on your breathing, I suspect. But there's another grand tradition of Buddhist meditation, which is walking meditation. This temple was an instrument of walking meditation. You start at the lower tiers and you walk very slowly, meditating on each step. And to keep yourself focused, or in case your mind wanders, your mind will wander to the stories of Gautama Buddha's life, which are represented in the walls surrounding the path. And then at a certain point, once you've been walking for several hours up in a spiral pattern up each level of the terrace of the temple, you emerge at the top, where all the sculpture falls away, the rectilinear form gives way to a curvilinear form, and it is meant to offer an experience of moving from one plane to another, from one reality to another, from one experiential existence to a distinct and separate experiential existence. All of a sudden, the views of the surrounding valley are available, whereas before you were in the narrow channel between the sculptures. And so this is just an example of how architecture can be more than just a passive reflection of culture, but an active instrument for extending and reproducing culture. Now, in this case, the culture died out. The Buddhists were swept away in a wave of first Hinduism, and then several centuries later of Islam. And so this temple was buried for many centuries by the forest and was only rediscovered when the British colonial powers took over from the Dutch. Now, back to Schumacher and his argument. Schumacher's argument is familiar to us because it resonates with the way we taught the history of architecture for most of the time we have been teaching the history of architecture, which is that every society has buildings. Some of them are very sophisticated cultural expressions. But the best is, of course, the European tradition of architecture. And Sir Bannister Fletcher, who wrote the book that was used for most of the late 19th, early 20th, actually most of the 20th century, early 20th century. This was the opening diagram of the book that demonstrated his attitude and the most prevailing attitude as to what was the status of the different traditions of architecture around the world. And so you see the roots in things like geometry, geography, geology, climate, religion, social values, and history. And out of those roots, this grand tree, the main trunk of which passes through the Greek and Roman tradition and up into the European, the identifiably distinct European styles. And then up at the top, at the very center, you have the Flatiron Building in the United States in Manhattan, not surprisingly. So this is a very Eurocentric view of the distribution of architecture. Sir Bannister Fletcher is just one of his generation who promoted this view, held this view, and promoted it. And Schumacher's view was simply extending that. This is Wolf Schumacher's Villa Isola in Bandung also, where he unabashedly said, we here in the Netherlands Indies are part of a global culture. As a matter of fact, the idea of the Netherlands Indies was, as a colony, was in the process at this moment of evolving into a new identity for what we now think of as Indonesia. The new identity was Eastern Netherlands. The future of the Netherlands was as two parts, Eastern Netherlands and Western Netherlands. And this isn't so crazy. We actually do, in the present, just a few years ago, the Netherlands Antilles, the three islands, Curacao, Bonaire, and Aruba, maybe you've gone windsurfing there, were given the opportunity. Do you want to be an independent country? Do you want to be some type of territorial holding of the Netherlands? Or do you want to be a state? Or do you want to be part of one of the states over there in Holland, in Europe? And each of the three islands made a different choice. And it's a very interesting situation. So it's not so far-fetched that Indonesia might possibly have been the eastern half of the Netherlands. But that, in great part, was the most important context for the debate between Schumacher and Pont. They were basically trying to decide what the future of Java was going to be. Was it going to be simply, and they were deciding it through the architecture. So the architecture, like Borobudur, was not, the architecture that they were debating was not simply a reflection, a neutral reflection of the culture and the values of the time. It was very much seen in the eyes of everyone in that auditorium that night as an instrument for producing one type of future or another. Schumacher was seeing the future of Java as being the Eastern Netherlands, and Pont was seeing it as something else. He was looking at some type of hybrid cultural formation. And so the two themes between Schumacher and Pont are really between this Eurocentric diffusionism that was prevalent at the time versus a legitimate formation, hybridization of cultures. And the analogy that was so common at the time that Pont used was that after hundreds of years of Dutch men showing up in Java, and it took a long time before Dutch women were comfortable coming to this faraway land. So there were a lot of people who were of mixed lineage. And they were and are more beautiful, considered to be more beautiful than anybody else, more beautiful than the Europeans and more beautiful than the Javanese. And so there was a very comfortable analogy in the intermarriage of races. And this was, even to the present day, if you want to be a movie star in Indonesia, you should have some mixed blood. It's pretty much taken for granted. And if you do have mixed blood, people often say, oh, you should be a movie star. It's a very strange racial configuration. And race comes directly into this argument in a very dramatic way from our current perspective. Schumacher said, you can tell that the stone monuments of Borobudur and Prambanan are more worthy of extending forward because of the form. The forms of these stone temples are noble forms. And in contrast, the wooden structures of the Javanese palaces and the houses and the day-to-day architectural manifestations of Javanese life didn't have the noble cornice, the noble profiles, the section, the detail, the expressiveness of the form was clearly a sign of a decadent culture. And he related it directly to a popular science at the time of phrenology. In Europe, it was taken for granted, and if you've read Ornament and Crime, perhaps, yes. If you've read Ornament and Crime, you're familiar with it was taken for granted, and Loos felt quite comfortable writing that someone with tattoos is either a criminal or will soon be a criminal. And similarly, in the same vein, you can tell by someone's, the shape of their forehead and their skull, whether they are noble or savages. And those were the terms that were used. And so these stone structures, like these skulls, you could tell from the shape of the stone structures that they were expressive of noble civilizing forces. And you could tell similarly from the forms of the wooden structures that they were of very low cultural breeding and of savage nature. And this was the argument that Schumacher assembled or put forth on the stage. And to a large extent, Schumacher won that debate in 1923. At the time, there were world's expositions that were very important instruments as well to make the connection back to this theme. The global expositions were very important instruments of promoting cultural values and for justifying the colonial project that the natives of Southeast Asia, archipelago of what we now think of as Indonesia, which is really 400 different cultures, they don't really have an appreciation of their own culture. And so it takes our ethnographic, anthropological, scientific researchers to show them to themselves. And so here we see the Hindu Javanese form that when Islam came to Java, the Hindu believers were swept out except for around one volcano, beautiful place, I recommend it, and then this other place which is probably much more famous than Java or Indonesia itself, which is the island of Bali. On the island of Bali, there was a very strong Hindu-Javanese, now Hindu-Balinese culture, and this is the architectural expression of the most sacred buildings and temples. It's a roof that comes to a point. There's always an odd number of roofs, and these are basically the expressions. And this is the type of thing that McLean Pont started to research after this debate, actually before this debate and after. After this debate, Pont decided to basically stop his architectural practice for a while and do research. And so off he went. And one of the things that happened that he learned was that when Islam came to Java, they did not bring the Middle Eastern mosque or the Mughal dome-like forms from India that we associate with Islam. They Islam is a highly adaptive cultural force, and thus part of its power. And they adapted this Hindu Javanese form, codified it as a three-tier roof coming to a point, and this became the form of identifiable Javanese Islam, which swept through the island and took root and is prevalent to this day. One of the arguments that Schumacher used was that these wooden structures are so primitive, you can tell they're primitive, they don't even understand how structures work. And since all of you understand how structures work, I can move quickly through this. When you put a beam on its side, flat on its side, it's kind of wobbly, and when you stand it up on its side, it's much stronger. You probably have done some version of this, calculating the moment of inertia of a 2x4. In one orientation, it's about 3 inches to the fourth, and at the other orientation, you turn it up, and it's much stronger, something around 11 inches to the fourth. The deeper you go with the element, the more dramatic this distinction is. In this case, it's almost 10 times stronger on end than it is. And so this proves that the Javanese practice of construction was primitive. Their beams that catch the roof rafters are laid in the wrong direction, and the rafters themselves are also laid in the wrong direction. Clearly, they don't know what they're doing. It's not sophisticated. A child could do better, was the thinking. And so on Schumacher goes. These are also in Bandung, very direct emulation in the 1930s of what was happening in Europe just a few years before. These buildings are still there. And this is a tradition that we recognize. We actually continue to deal with these questions. What is the proper position of architecture globally in the 21st century? And there are a lot of different views on this. One of the most dramatic views is offered by Hans Ebelings with this book called Supermodernism. And like a good architect, he is promoting and pushing forward the agenda of the 20th century modernism beyond the chasm that was, that brief aberration that was postmodernism. Stay tuned next week, right? And catapult forward in this very forward-looking avant-garde, supporting the avant-garde approach of architecture. Onward Christian soldiers. So it's very much a part of this tradition. You'd have to redraw it, but the spirit is very similar. And also Charles Jenks did his part, kind of ignoring the unself-conscious 80% of the environment and really focusing on the isms of the cutting-edge avant-garde movements. And if he were redoing this today, he would figure out some way to make it the 1% and the 99%, because he'd probably switch sides as well. He's very much in favor of the 20%, just pointing out how unimportant the 80% is, but he's a flexible guy. And so you see this beautiful hotel. I'll be staying in this hotel in 3 weeks, I'm happy to say. Very nice hotel. Unabashedly being brought to the Netherlands Indies, it fit right in because this city of Bandung is filled with Art Deco buildings from the colonial Dutch period. And this is a Dutch period where it was very much the agenda after centuries of oppressively sucking as much of the resource wealth out of these islands as they possibly could as quickly as possible, and employing an army of native Javanese to help them deplete these islands of resources. In the 19th century, the focus on producing sugar and coffee and tobacco was so intense that tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people died of starvation. because there wasn't enough food to eat, because the colonial powers were pushing so hard to increase the production of sugar, of cash commodities, cash crops. And so a young man in his 20s, his early 20s, who was in the he was a Dutch servant of the colonial service who worked on a plantation. He wrote a book under the pseudonym Multatuli, and the book went viral and became a very popular book all over the world, especially in the Netherlands. And it spoke of the horrors of colonialism in Sumatra and Java, and was such a powerful force, this work of fiction, that it told the story so forcefully that the Dutch government had to change course. They had to turn it around 180 degrees. So in 1899, largely as the result of this one book that was written, the Queen of the Netherlands made a speech, and she said, "We are going to stop oppressing the people of the Dutch East Indies, and we are going to open a new period that they called the ethical policy period." And so the ethical policy period was a time of giving back to the Javanese people to compensate them and give them the legitimacy and the dignity so deserving an equal partner, or almost equal, well, not really equal at all, but a more equal partner in the nation, the global reach of this empire of the Netherlands. And so you started to get all of these European constructions in Bandung. And so the history of colonialism is filled with these types of stories. What is the role of architecture? In the ethical policy period, and during the time of the debate between Schumacher and Pont, they were unified in this one issue. They differed only in how best to go about it, but they were unified in the issue that the new architecture of the Dutch East Indies must be a source of pride for everyone, for the Dutch, for the Javanese, the people of mixed race. It needed to be something that everyone was proud of, and that was the key to legitimizing the continued existence of the Dutch in Southeast Asia. And so this is very much a demonstration of an attitude that if you are looking for it, you will see it in the world today. Architecture is not just a passive reflection of values and meanings. It is an instrument of achieving certain very specific goals, whether they be economic or political or social or cultural. It is an instrument. And if we simply treat architecture as a passive expression of values, or even say, no, it's about information, it's about new technologies and new techniques, then we're missing the point, and we're missing the potential of architecture. We also risk falling into a trap of allowing our architecture to be mobilized by forces that we may or may not agree with. If we assume that it's a neutral act, then it is available for to be commandeered and used by others for whatever means they might fit. The argument in this is it's useful to have an idea of what's going on in the bigger forces. And this is true in the histories we tell. George Orwell said memorably that he who controls the past controls the future. And so every history that we tell is really a story. We tell a story like Multatuli told a story, and it brought an end to oppressive colonial rule. Historians tell stories, and these stories are very rarely, if ever, neutral. And that's why you might hear your instructors refer to history. Instead of calling it architectural history, you may hear us speak of it as architectural history theory. Because for every history, Unless you're going to tell every detail of everything that's ever happened, you're going to have to choose some things and leave other things out. As soon as you start to choose some things and leave the other things out, you are editing the factual record. You are choosing to look at some things and not the other, and you're already expressing a point of view. That's the theory part. History is always informed by an idea, even when, or especially when, someone is trying to tell you, no, this is just the facts. I'm just telling you the facts. Chances are that the facts that you're getting are very carefully selected, whether the person doing the selection is aware of that or not. That's why it's useful to think of history as history theory. And so we look at other examples. This is not unique to colonial Java. Just to stay in the neighborhood of Asia and the colonial period of modernism, we can look at Japan. In 1868, an American gunboat came into Tokyo Harbor and said, "Hello, Japan. We would like to welcome you to the rest of the world. Please end your isolation now. And we want to be your partners." And so Japan opened to the world. The Meiji Restoration was all of a sudden a dramatic, sudden modernization of Japan. And to make a long story short, they sent architects to London to learn architectural styles. The aesthetic movement in London was a direct response to this debate between Gothic and classical architecture, which you may have talked about in another lecture. Logier's primitive hut versus Viollet-le-Duc's primitive hut. Something, yeah. So the aesthetic movement was a way to say, yeah, you scholars, you figure that out. In the meantime, we're going to make architecture for the sake of architecture. This is going to be beautiful. That's what's important. It's going to use rich, luscious materiality, red brick, white stone. And so in London, it had one meaning. It was, you scholars, stay out of our business. We're going to just make beautiful buildings. In Tokyo train station, very direct importing of the aesthetic movement style, it meant something completely different. It became a symbol of imperial Japanese power and modernity. And Japan was itself a colony, a colonizer. And they had a colony in Taiwan, where this building became a symbol of Japanese modernity. And in Seoul, South Korea, some of you may know this building. It became a symbol, not just an expression, but it also became an active instrument of demonstrating the superiority of Japanese power. At least that's what it meant until the end of Japanese colonial rule. What does it mean now? Some of you probably have a view of what it means now. Similar thing happened in Shanghai. You know that the British love their tea, and they get their tea from China. But back before there was an international monetary exchange, the only way the British could purchase tea from China is if they had Chinese currency. And the only way they could get Chinese currency prior to there being international exchanges was to sell things to the Chinese. The problem was they didn't have anything that the Chinese wanted or needed. So they did what any reasonable capitalist power would do. They forced their colonial farmers in India to grow opium, and they addicted the Chinese people on opium and sold them opium once they were addicted. Problem solved, mission accomplished. Lots of money from China from the opium trade to pay for the tea, to satisfy the British addiction for tea. But there was a problem. The Chinese didn't like this, and so they ransacked one of the ships. That was an act of war. The British came in, dispatched the Chinese naval forces, and took over Shanghai, which became an international holding, and became one of the largest international cities, one of the most expressive skylines in the world, similar to Manhattan at the time. They had about the same height competition between Manhattan and Shanghai back in the 1920s. So this is about the same time as the Schumacher-Pont debate in Bandung. This is a very powerful expression of the international commercial operations in China. It was also its most important instrument of maintaining that capitalist trade between Asia and Europe. A similar thing happened several decades later. In 1980, Deng Xiaoping declared a new policy for China to open its doors to international trade. And one of the first things they did was they hired international architects to enter a competition for the design of Pudong. You've probably heard this story before. That Pudong that you see down in the lower image became, again, in competition with Manhattan. That it became, this is Pudong here, and this is the Bund here. So the Bund was well preserved during the communist period of Mao Zedong because he was very much against cities. So the Bund was pretty much abandoned for several decades during Mao's period. And so it was available for renovation in 1980 when Deng Xiaoping opened up Shanghai to the world. And then across the Huangpo River in Pudong, we have, at that time, one of the most dramatic, rapid expansions of an urban center in human history. Since then, Dubai has surpassed it. And Jeddah, and so architecture is on the move still, and it's very much a powerful trajectory in this direction. And here you see how the architecture plays a very important role in the deployment of symbolism in every possible way. And here's the tourist visit to Pudong on the right and the Bund on the left. The global city of capitalism in the 1920s and the new global city of capitalism in the 21st century. And even the Boston Globe is in on the act. Here's another global diffusion that brings us back to Bandung. You've studied Frank Lloyd Wright, I suspect. Frank Lloyd Wright himself inherited a great deal from H.H. Richardson and Louis Sullivan before him, but also other places as well. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright was an interesting regional architect, very much tuned into the character and the qualities of light of the Midwestern prairie. And his prairie houses are a very rich extension of what he understood as being the essence of the American landscape and how to bring that landscape into architecture. And so he was a very successful local architect, some prominence in the outside of the Chicago area in the United States. But his big break was in 1910, after he had pretty much completed his series of prairie-style houses, culminated in the Roby House. His drawings and his buildings were published in this little folio. He had a big fan in Germany, and this was published and distributed in Germany and became the basis of a whole new explosion of architectural exploration in Europe, leading eventually to the Gestalt movement, and the influence on the Bauhaus is very powerful, even if it's suppressed historically. This lineage is traceable. It's most clearly evident in the Amsterdam School in the aftermath of this publication, especially in the extension of Amsterdam to the south by Henri Berlage, and Michel de Klerk, the architect of this building in 1917. And anything that's happening in Amsterdam is going to happen in its colonies very soon after. But before we get back to Bandung, the same year as de Klerk is designing the Eigen van Haard in the southern extension of Amsterdam along the lines of Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie Style, Frank Lloyd Wright himself is being commissioned to design a hotel in Tokyo. Up to this moment, Frank Lloyd Wright this Japanese culture was not new to him. He was actually hired by the Boston's Museum of Fine Arts to expand its collection of Japanese prints. And so the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston financed Frank Lloyd Wright's travels to Japan to purchase prints, fine prints, which had a deep influence on his thinking, both his rendering style and his architectural design, and led to this commission for the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, Japan, completed in the 1920s. And so an interesting thing happens here is that Frank Lloyd Wright isn't just emulating the prairie. He is, in this later period, he starts to open up to influences of other cultural forms. In some cases, this might be characterized as a Mayan source. And an interesting thing happens in the hotel that Wolf Schumacher designs back in Bandung shortly after this debate that he has with Henri Maclean-Pont. He adopts this Mayan style. It's not clear how conscious Schumacher was of Frank Lloyd Wright's, the parallel with Frank Lloyd Wright. But here's Schumacher's tower using the Neo-Mayan style. This is in Bandung. And then that's compared with Frank Lloyd Wright's Imperial Hotel. This is a comparison I just found this morning, so the jury's still out. And so the next theme I'd like to look at is to bolster this argument. In order to bolster this argument, I'd like to take a slight tangent to the writings of Nelson Goodman, who wrote a very interesting piece called How Buildings Mean. And basically, to very quickly cover this, he says buildings mean in 4 ways. The first way that buildings mean is they explicitly declare their meaning in the text that is imprinted in the buildings. So in the Lincoln Memorial, which is Nelson Goodman's example, he says it's inscribed in the building itself. It says, this is what this building means. The second way that buildings mean, as seen in this image, is he calls it exemplification. Now, if you have been looking at phenomenology or recent publications from Stephen Hall, Johanni Palasma, this might be familiar to you, not under the word exemplification, but in the word experience. And it's very closely linked to another popular word in architecture, which is performance or performativity. It's not about what the text says the building means. It's about what the building does. What does the architecture do? How does it perform? And this is independent. This is seen as being legitimate in the culture of architectural practice because it doesn't depend on egghead scholars. It doesn't depend on you reading the brochure before you experience the building. You could hatch from an egg, emerge fully formed, and experience that for yourself. In a way, I like to think of it as Missouri rules. Missouri is the show me state. Don't tell me about it, show it to me. And so by experiencing the building, that's the true source of meaning. That's the authentic source of what the architecture means, is through what it does. And this happens at the architectural scale as well as the urban scale. The city of Washington, D.C. is filled with exemplifications or constructed experiences that are very explicit about what it's supposed to mean, from the Lincoln Memorial up to Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial. And then the third way that Nelson Goodman tells us buildings mean is through its symbolism, its metaphor, its use of ideas that are pre-encoded in forms. These forms, the fluted columns, have a culturally accepted meaning. And so they're deployed in this architecture in order to convey that meaning. And then finally, it's what happens outside of the building itself, or outside of the act of creating architecture. Things happen. The Lincoln Memorial gets put on the $5 bill. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gives a powerful speech on the steps that is seen as a galvanizing moment of the civil rights movement. So these are called mediated, Nelson Goodman calls these mediated experiences, or mediated meanings, mediated aspects of the architecture. And so this is a very clear thing when we look at some buildings. The World Trade Center towers had one meaning when it was first built. It has a completely different meaning after the events of 9/11. Okay, I need some tech support here. Okay, thank you. And the new memorial does all of these things. It has graphic, it has literary inscriptions of all the names. It has the experiential source of meaning, and it has the mediated references. It also has the symbolism. And so all of those four things are there. Now, Kenneth Frampton, who wrote the thing that I'm sure you all read for today, made a very powerful, through a series of publications that are listed on the sheet, made a powerful argument in favor of the experiential, that things mean what they mean because of the way they're experienced. And he lists these characteristics and gives examples. And the first examples he gave, especially the ones in the reading you had, might not be very well known to you. But the ideas or the operation, once you get the scent of what it is he's talking about, it's hard not to see it all over the place. In Peter Zumthor's thermal baths, the world is filled with these experiential values and meanings that are embedded in the experience of the architecture in general, but more specifically in terms of Kenneth Frampton, in the details, in the materials that are used, and the quality of light that is produced by those materials and the way they are used, in the way that the details are related to the larger forms of the architecture. And so this brings us back to Bandung. After the debates that Henri Maclean-Aponte felt that he had lost, and arguably he did lose those debates, at least in the short run, he left Bandung and he went east to explore some of these architectures of Java. And he skipped the stone monuments and went straight to the wooden architectures and traditions. And here you see the diagrams that he produced, summarizing his research. He looked specifically at the sagging beams and the sagging rafters of these wooden structures. And he said, you know, they're not stupid. They knew it was going to sag, just like we know why this piece of paper is a little droopy until you bend it. We know that. So what if they did it on purpose? And so his theory, his idea, is that they did it on purpose, that these structures are more like tents than they are Greek temples. It's not about creating these rigid, straight elements. It's about embracing the nature of the material to allow that material to sag. And so he looks at the series of wooden structures, including in the palace in Solo, in the palace in Yogyakarta, the Grand Mosque of Yogyakarta that we saw in an earlier image. So he looks in all of these places, and you'll notice something about the way he's drawing these rafters. He puts ever so slight a sag in each of these rafters, just like the tensile structure of the tent. And another. So this is kind of where my path crosses the path of Pont. Like you, I went to an excellent school of architecture, and like you might experience this. I hope not, but I'm sorry if you do. When you graduate, you will do your best to work for all the best architects like I did, and then something will happen and you'll find yourself without a job. And you know, I did what anyone would do. I took a job as the royal architect for the King of Java. Hey, you know, it's great work if you can get it. And so here I am. I didn't realize that Pont did this, and I'm actually studying this joint right here before I ever had any idea that I was retracing the steps of Pont. So there I am up in the joint, puzzling over what the heck is going on. These rafters seem to be hanging over the beam like a fulcrum, and this lower roof seems to be pulling down like a seesaw, the way he's drawn it. Sure enough, the rafters hang over this beam, and this lower roof is weighting it. These beams sag, but then that teeter-totter action tends to prop it up in a way that actually starts to lift the apex of the roof. And what I found by speaking to the priest/architects/builders who are responsible for these structures is that, yes, indeed, every element has a name. The name refers to its technical function, but also to its spiritual function. And so here's a very clear example of a building that is not just a passive expression, but it is intended to be an active demonstration of these powerful spiritual ideas. And sure enough, it was freely floating. It wasn't rigidly connected. This is the thing I was investigating. It was basically a testing of the idea of the operation of the tectonics of this wooden structure. MacLean of Pont got a commission where he put into play these instincts. And this is one of the clear examples of a hybrid cultural formation. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And I don't have examples of all the Disney mistakes, the Disney-like mistakes that happen when you attempt this. If you're going to do this, you have to do it well. You have to do it right. I'm chose instead to focus on positive examples, but if you ever try to do this, watch out. Don't take the easy path. Well, Pont took his engineering understanding from his school days in Delft, and he developed a steel-connected wood truss system for the inside of this school, which is still in existence. Very much in the spirit of the arts and crafts movement that was still going at the time. And he built, he had the commission to build this technical school in 1924. 1921 is when he started it. So he was doing this even before the debates. And so if you're an anthropologist and you look at this, you'll say, he's faking it. He's mixing all kinds of things together. This is a mockery. This is a Disneyfication of the whole thing. You know, there's a Minangkabau roof mixed with the Sundanese detail of the eaves. And those columns, what are those columns? That's straight out of Frank Lloyd Wright in Arts and Crafts. This is a joke. But he refines it very, very carefully. And what I claim is this is actually a clear example of a hybrid cultural formation. He is taking his understanding of European technology and culture and aesthetic movements and marrying them with his very deep understanding of Javanese tectonics and materiality. And these two are giving birth to a beautiful child. And it happens again and again. This was supposed to be the new capital of the Dutch Indies, built very much in this same vein of marrying the best of what's happening in the Amsterdam school with a deep understanding of the tectonic realities of what's happening in Java. Now I just have two more examples, which should put me exactly at 2:20, which is where we want to be. Is that where we want? What time do we end? I keep forgetting. 2:40. Okay. I will indulge ever so slightly more, but get your questions ready. Okay. Do you recognize this? Have you done this building? This is the lecture I introduced to this course way back when, and I was just wondering if it was still in it or not. Okay. This is Renzo Piano's Jibao Cultural Center, a very recent 1993 parallel project to what the Dutch were looking at. You may have heard of the Grand Projet of the French. You may have heard of, what's it called, Beaubourg, Pompidou Center. You may have heard of La Défense. You may have heard of all of these projects that were very big in France. Some of the most profoundly overpriced projects of our time. And after they were finished, someone said, hey, not only are you doing every single one of your projects in Paris, but France is bigger than that pentagonal thing in Europe. What about your territorial holdings in the South Pacific? And being culturally sensitive and politically correct, they said, sacre bleu, pardon, we must do something for the rest of our French citizens. So they mobilized an identity tectonics project to reflect the larger cultural aspirations of French citizens in New Caledonia, the other side of the planet. A few decades earlier, they were using such places to test nuclear warheads. Now, we hire, once again, our favorite architect of the Grand Projet, Renzo Piano, no longer in partnership with Richard Rogers, but hey, he's the culturally sensitive one, so let's bring him in. And so they built a cultural center devoted to the martyred fighter for the French to stay in New Caledonia. It's the Jibao Cultural Center. Renzo Piano does something that would normally get someone kicked out of the club of avant-garde architects. He hired an anthropologist to look at local cultural manifestations of the New Caledonian people and this society, and he comes up with this project. And so these are his drawings to develop an understanding not just of the indigenous tectonics of the Kanak people, but also the landscape, the topography, the vegetation, a very in-depth study of all of these elements as a point of inspiration. And you can probably relate to this. There's a lot of weaving in the Kanak culture, and it becomes very much a part of the menu of options for inspiration. It goes up on the inspiration wall in Renzo Piano's studio, and it's something that's available for him to choose from. And now here you see these juxtapositions of the point of inspiration and the end result. Maybe you see something, maybe you don't. And that's the way it should be. If you saw something very direct and literal, it would be Disney. But to the extent that you sense some characteristic, to the extent that you sense a resonance between the point of inspiration and the architecture, then piano is successful. And during the process of this project, piano is struggling constantly with walking this line. He doesn't want to mimic. He doesn't even want to emulate. He wants to capture some essence that is ethereal and non-tangible and not direct. He cannot be literal. And the key moment of truth for him comes when all his diagrams and models prior to this breakthrough brought these ribs up to a point. Even though there were these half shells, the ribs came up to a point. It was just too much like the Connaught huts. And when he pulls the fingers apart, all of a sudden everything is released. It's too much like the huts, it's too much like the trees. But when he pulls the fingers of the ribs apart, it starts to open up more than just literally. It opens up in terms of the performance, what it does, and what it does expressively. And so the image that should be here is this one. So the real test here is the extent to which the juxtaposition of Renzo Piano's shells and this original tectonic expression, what happens in that juxtaposition? Is it too literal, or is it, does it resonate in a way that opens up possibilities for the future and offers a lot of hope? The last project I want to show you, it's really a few projects that I don't know if you've heard about this or not. In Bali, a woman who preceded me and working with the king of Java, she left Java and the palace in Java and went to Bali, where she established an institute for bamboo. And I'm just recalling on the fly here that a RISD student was one of the early graduates of this program, Maya Buxton. I don't know, it was probably several years ago by now. But she went to this program, and at the time they were really trying to figure out, how do you work with bamboo? Bamboo has significant problems, technical and cultural. These people understand that only peasants live in bamboo houses. So it's culturally anathema to them. And so they had to overcome that. Also, there were several technical problems. Bamboo decays, especially when it comes in contact with water. So they had to develop a new set of details at the base of the bamboo columns that allowed the bamboo to remain protected from moisture and yet very much embedded structurally into the footings. And so they achieved this and started to produce, to explore the possibilities of these bent structural element forms, very much like the bent structural elements of the Javanese wood tradition. And so recently, this international school has opened to rave reviews. They won an Aga Khan Award for architecture, despite the fact that I don't know if there's ever been a Muslim person anywhere near this, but they couldn't turn it down. Hindu Shmindu, go ahead. Let's give it an award before someone else does. But the tectonic expression is quite powerful, and it kind of joins the ranks of these sculptors who are using bamboo in a more sculptural way to populate the roof of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and OMA and the other sculpture parks in upstate New York. Suddenly bamboo is where it's at, and to the point where you know, it's in competition, I think, I would go so far as to say it's in competition with the parametricist school of formal design. Could you build this with a 3D printer? Sure, but why bother? The tectonic logic of the material forces you, compels the architecture to develop within a certain vocabulary of form, which eliminates all kinds of other possible forms, which makes it the opposite of the 3D printer and the opposite of parametric form exploration. So is it better because of that, or is it worse because of that? You know, the jury's still out. But that's the image I'll stop on. So thank you for your patience. Yes. This is called the Green School in English. It's an international school in Bali.
Was it like the way that they had it bent in the first picture you showed us, the bamboo pieces? Is that like a calculated bend, or is it just because they all seem like they're like uniformly? I'm curious because you said it has like specific characteristics, and I'm curious as to how they use them.
Well, bamboo, like other structural elements, have very predictable structural qualities. If it's this diameter, if it's a certain species and it's this diameter and that long, it will bend in this way under the same forces. It will bend predictably. It will perform structurally in predictable ways. There is a structural engineer that has to check all these things. But mostly it's done by empirical practice in the field. And elements are rejected if there's an aberration in the growth pattern. But bamboo is very consistent and it grows very fast. And it's a tremendous resource if you can overcome the technical and cultural limitations.
I think speaks to the other side of this coin, and it's something that is always a concern with a lot of the students here, which is this notion of equating modernism with Westernism and modernization with Westernization,
Right.
and how, yes, there he is. And this is obviously an explicit example of the opposite of some of the examples you were showing us.
This is not the Acropolis, nor is it the Colosseum. It's the Acropolium. And it's used to sell real estate. This is China. This is not Versailles. This is a real estate development in China. There's the kitchen. But you can tell, you know, this is just for show. The real kitchen is over there where they make incredible food, but there's no light. It's a concrete floor. They squat like this with propane stoves and brilliant, wonderful food. This is for the family to entertain their friends. They get Pepsi and Doritos from here. And the servants aren't allowed to use the refrigerator. They have their own refrigerator. So things like that. It's not really Rodeo Drive, but you knew that. Yeah. So just, those were some of my favorite examples. But I have thousands of these as well. Not hybrid cultural formation. Just to contrast it. This is a superficial copying of what gets broadcast from Southern California every day as the update. This is what the good life looks like. If you want to make a lot of money, sell some version of what you're seeing on TV. And if you want to impress your friends, buy some version of what you're all seeing on TV. It's a big industry, and it's the 99% of what happens in the world today. The 1% are these testing the edges of hybrid, legitimate, authentic, what I claim are legitimate, authentic hybrid cultural formations with the help of Kenneth Frampton to a large extent. Good question. Yes?
I was wondering if there's
we think?
Yeah, or would you kind of see a lot of, like, is there anything that you're taught, especially in architecture study, that you're kind of like, well, that was a real philosophy that I don't have now?
Right. Well, there's the culture of architecture is a very strange thing, and I'm happy to say that it is changing dramatically and rapidly. But when I went to the Cooper Union, we were being trained to go out and man the trenches of the cutting edge of the avant-garde. That was our mission, and it was very clear to us. Our faculty were very clear. And anything that has been done before, do it the opposite. If this is the standard way of hanging, don't do anything, but don't do that. And now that I'm teaching, I teach the same thing. I say, whatever's been done before, don't do that if you have an opportunity to do something better. If it's connected to a big idea where you have an opportunity to test an idea and see what it does. Otherwise, just do some generic solution so you don't distract us from what you're really doing. So I both admire that, but I think I'm also influenced by this one thing that happened one afternoon at Cooper Union. John Haydick, he never would talk to us. He was just kind of there. He was like a ghost. He would come and go. You'd see him every once in a while. But this one day, he said, okay, I want everyone, he just got everyone in the entire school together in one space, and we were crammed in. The master was going to speak to us. He said, I just got off the phone with a recent graduate who was happy to tell me that he just got a commission to do a house on Long Island. And I said, that's great. But then he told me that, of course, I can't really do the things I learned in school. And Haydick just blew his top and said, why did he say that? I can't believe he said that. Of course you can. You have to do what you learned in school. What is his problem? And he was clearly very troubled by the avant-garde monster he had created. And he would constantly struggle with this thing, and he would constantly say that architecture is the most social of all the arts. You don't walk into a painting, but you do walk into architecture. The performativity, to use current language, matters. And so I think, in a way, he was predicting what I hope we're going through now, which is we are still about exploring and pushing the edge, but not at the expense of humanity. And what I tell my students, and I feel that John Haydick would approve, is that be a human first and an architect second. And this goes very much against what I felt when I was in school. The message when I was in school was, hey, humans, let the other people be humans. You're an architect. And that's what this recent graduate was basically expressing. He was looking for permission from John Haydick to be a human. And John Haydick's response was, there's no conflict. And I'm happy to say that I think increasingly there is no conflict. But whenever there is, choose human first, then architect. I think. That would be a place to end. All right.